Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is part of the debt series, and the discussion today, I think, is going to be wild. I'm talking with Luke Kemp about David Graeber's claim that there are millennia-long debt cycles in history that we can trace. So, Luke, welcome to the show. Do you want to tell the listeners first a little bit about who you are?
Of course. Thank you for having me, Graham. I am currently a senior research associate at the University of Notre Dame. I'm usually a research affiliate back in the University of Cambridge at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, also known as CSER. The centre sounds a little bit weird, right? It's existential risk, but essentially what it means is we study any big global catastrophe that could cause either global societal collapse or human extinction. I, in particular, work on what some people call macro history, but I prefer calling it deep history. Essentially, looking at any kind of problem and trying to trace it back to its very deepest historical roots, often all the way back hundreds of thousands of years, at the very least, usually 5,000 years.
Okay, yeah, and this explains, as we were chatting about before, why I invited you onto the show. I'm very comfortable with perhaps we could call it micro history. I wouldn't want to call it shallow history. I'm fascinated with histories of things that happened over the course of a single week, perhaps. You know, you can study documents and understand. I'm very interested in looking at these things. People say, "Oh, the French Revolution was this," and I'm always suspicious of that sort of claim. And actually, the French Revolution was many things, and it was different week by week. So I'm skeptical to begin with about this entire field, especially since we don't have a lot of written documents. But I've been impressed by your work, which is why I invited you on, because as I mentioned to you also, I'm worried about quackery, wild speculative claims about prehistory.
And that is an understandable concern. I think there's often this tension between historians who really focus very heavily and in depth upon one historical period or even event, and macro historians who usually try to take a much broader, longer view. But for me, I think we can best understand causation when we do comparison. It's really hard to know what's causing something unless you have some kind of comparator to actually use against it. And on top of that, the more comparators you have, the better, of course. And additionally, unless you're going to engage in counterfactual reasoning, that's kind of all you can do within history. You don't really have any natural experiments you can do that frequently. So unless you're going to do counterfactual reasoning, which most historians aren't, apart from, I think, Walter Scheidl's been one of the few exceptions to that, you kind of have to engage in some kind of comparative reasoning. And that's where I find the beauty of doing deep history, is it allows you to look for these larger trends and actually compare, contrast, and understand where are things converging despite huge differences in time and geography, and where do you have the big divergences?
Okay. I need to break in real quick and say two things. First of all, if you're not a historian, counterfactual history just means historians imagining if something different had happened in history. So counterfactual is just a pretentious way of saying, imagine the past turned out different. And secondly, every historian does counterfactual history, Luke, at parties. They simply don't do it in writing.
I think that's partially true. I think, and everyone loves doing a counterfactual, right? It's like, imagine this alternative scenario. However, there's better and worse ways of doing this. There's a huge difference between going to a party and saying, imagine if Rome had come back. The only actual really rigorous way I've seen of doing this was Walter Scheidl, who's a professor at Stanford of classics. And in his book, Escape from Rome, basically tries to think through, why didn't Rome come back? And if it did, what would have changed? And to do so, it's not just simply kind of an imagination or a thought experiment. He actually goes through really precisely what was it that led to the ascent of the Roman Empire? What were the differences between Europe in particular, where basically you have this one overarching empire for a pretty short period of time, and then thereafter it's polycentric, versus, say, China, where you have consistent unified empire for a large swathe of the land. And he compares things like geography, linguistics, bureaucracy, a whole bunch of other factors, some contingent, some much more deep-rooted, to basically put together a picture of what can we have expected in this kind of counterfactual scenario. So I think you're right that everyone does counterfactuals, just some people do it lazily, and what I'm calling for is people do it actually rigorously and well, which I think Walter's done really well.
All right, excellent. That's fantastic. All right, let's get into this, but So we're talking about this book, Debt, the first 5,000 years, and I know absolutely nothing about anything. I mean, in depth, I have no knowledge of anything that's more than 200 years old. And antiquity. I've listened to podcasts, and I'm very interested in things like the Roman Empire. But man, if you get back to if we're talking Mesopotamia, like I was, Googling what is the difference between Assyria and Babylon before we talked, because I really like that's my level of knowledge. And I thought before we get into Graeber's claims, if you could tell us a little bit about how we periodize what is called prehistory, right? We call it prehistory,
Yeah.
if I've got this right, because history is people writing things. So we're not imagining is not the right word. I mean, I would say imagining, but if you're a historian, you would say we're trying to figure out as empirically as possible what happened in the past.
Yeah.
History is the study of what people wrote down, but we can still study it before it was written down. We call it prehistory, that sort of thing. So when we're thinking about this thing, the ancient Near East, Europe, Asia, Afro-Eurasia, prehistorically, what are we talking about before 5,000 years ago?
Yeah, so you're right. First of all, when we talk about history, it's usually recorded history. So it's the use of documents and actual kind of formalized scripts and writing, which really only accompanies a couple of states around the world. In particular, we have a script from the Indus Valley, but more importantly, we have China, Mesopotamia, and later on the Olmecs developer glyph script. Basically, the timeline here, the way we periodize history, the way we break up history, is the last 5,000 years is pretty much history. And beyond 5,000, you get prehistory. Prehistory, in the biggest sense, you can break up into four different kind of areas. One is what we could call the Paleolithic. And the Paleolithic, you break up into three. So this is one big bit. The Paleolithic, some people call the Stone Age. It's basically a period all the way from roughly 300 to 200,000 years ago, kind of the very point where humans break off and become our own individual species of Homo sapiens sapiens, and all the way through to roughly 12,000 years ago, when you have the beginning of the Holocene, which is when we exit from the last ice age and we enter into this period of unusually stable, warm climate that we're enjoying today. So that's the kind of upper Paleolithic. That's when people talk about Stone Age, when they talk about kind of hyperreal and hunter-gatherers. That's what they're really talking about. That is usually broken up into three periods, the lower, middle, and upper. We don't really need to go into that. And then the Holocene, so roughly 12,000 years ago, when you have this big entry into a new climate, you can then break that up in different periods. So some people like to break it up into the Mesolithic and the Chalcolithic and the Neolithic. And the Neolithic is basically when you start to get, it's the important one, the occurrence of pottery, farming, all these other big things that people associate with states in particular. That's more or less how people tend to break up prehistory in a very big sense. So pretty much you have the Paleolithic with those three different areas, and then you have the Holocene, the kind of post-Paleolithic, and we can break that further. I don't want to confuse you too much, but once we get beyond prehistory, once you start to get recorded history, there's a number of different ways people break it up, but the kind of typical one most people are probably familiar with is this idea of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, for instance. And most people would put the Bronze Age beginning roughly 3,300 BCE. That date may seem roughly familiar. It's roughly when you start to see the first states emerging. It's right about 3,200 BCE, so roughly 5,200 years ago, that you see Uruk, the first city-state of Mesopotamia. Around about the same time, you see the first dynasty of Egypt as well. So what's interesting, what people don't really remark upon here is that the periodization is actually really correlated with empire. When you see the first states, that's when we start talking about the Bronze Age. When we talk about the Iron Age, which is essentially after the late Bronze Age collapse, which is around about 1,200 to 1,100 BCE, so closer to, 3,000 years ago, basically, that's when you have the kind of collapse of all these different interconnected societies and empires across the Aegean and the Mediterranean, and you start to get the uptake of iron and the creation of Iron Age empires, such as both the Western Roman Empire as well as the Han Dynasty. So I think it's worth remarking just here once again that how closely interlinked this is to two different things. One is empire, that when you have a collapse of a big imperial system, that kind of echoes the end of a certain age. So from bronze to iron, for instance. from the Akkadians through to the Romans. And the second one that's really interesting here is that it's a really 1% view of history. Most people weren't using bronze or iron. It's really just what elites were using most of the time. Anyway, I don't want to belabor the point. Basically, that's how we usually break it up. So bronze is roughly 3,300 BC to 1,200 BC. Iron Age is roughly 1,200 BC to usually roughly 500 CE when you have the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Then we usually have the kind of medieval period, at least it's a very kind of European focus, until roughly 1,500. That's when you kind of enter the more early modern period, and then you can break up however you like from there.
Yeah,
That's your portrait. Rest of mine.
I'm quite happy to take over from the year 1500, although I won't do so right now. Yeah, that was all wonderful. I mean, a few things that are obviously going to be important for our discussion. One, the fact that when we look at these periods, it seems to start about 5,000 years ago. So Graeber is attempting to do in
Yep.
depth a history that is all of history, and then the dawn of everything, excuse me, is the prehistory book. So that's
Yep.
the first thing. It's not all of the existence of humanity, but that does claim to cover all of history. That's why it's the first 5,000 years.
Yep.
Second, it's obviously crucially important that what you are talking about is empires, and this standard periodization and way of thinking about history is very much focusing on these people that when we do history in the 19th and 20th century, we're trying to find ways to talk about the people who were ignored, non-elites, however you want to say it. I see Graeber's project as trying to do that sort of thing with the thousands of years where that work seems to be much harder to do. Empire is the heart of all of this. I know you and I have talked about the work of James C. Scott before as well. I mean, this is someone else who's trying to do this, and then this is a road I probably shouldn't go down, but my favorite prehistorian is this writer Lewis Mumford. I don't know what you think about Lewis Mumford, but he very much also, I would say, Mumford is, if not an avowed anarchist and anarchistic, he's trying to write an anti-state history, and he seems to prefer the Neolithic. Like Mumford loves the Neolithic and hates the imperial machine that is going to come. This 5,000 years Mumford sees as having been a mistake, I think.
Yeah, Mumford, I mean, keep in mind, each of these authors, of course, is in some way representative of their time. And so Mumford, the Neolithic, that was the kind of common terminology used at the time, introduced by an Australian archaeologist, actually, by the name of Gordon Child. And I definitely had some sympathies for Mumford. I think where I diverge a little bit is based upon the most recent source of archaeology we have. It's not like the Neolithic, so this period basically before the rise of the first states, but when you still have kind of the rise of inequality and stratification, farming, etc. That wasn't exactly a great place either. We often think of states as being this on-off switch. You either have a Uruk or the First Dynasty or not, but before that, you do have a lot of power struggles where it seems like there's a small group trying to create something like a state. And often this fails, often it falls apart. And some of the earliest examples we have of cities being abandoned appear to be exactly this, that you have a city coming together, and then at the first signs of inequality and of some group trying to impose domination upon another, people get out of there. So I think it wasn't as simple as like, once we get to Uruk and Egypt, everything's bad and everything's actually pretty good before then. I think it was more of a slow drift towards imperialism and domination.
Excellent. Now we're really rolling with Graeber because one of the key things that he's trying to write against, I mean, he must like Mumford, but he's definitely trying to write against this theory that is associated, among other things, with Marshall Salins, who was Graeber's dissertation director, that, everything was anarchistic and good, that we had an affluent society up until about 5,000 years ago, and then civilization happened and everything was bad. Graeber was clear. He wanted to have what he calls anarchism and also what is called civilization. He didn't, the anarcho-primitivist claim that you can have one or the other. You can have happy, equal hunter-gatherers or wealthy, powerful societies with immense corruption and inequality. Graeber believe that.
Mm,
And it seems to me that this cycles of history thing is an attempt to avoid a linear evolutionary version of history that says, I mean, if you just think of something like the Stone Age to the Copper Age to the Bronze Age to
yeah.
the Iron Age, that suggests that history progresses. It progresses in one direction, and that direction is greater technological achievement. And correspondingly, as our swords get better, the empires get bigger. And I take Graeber's cycle of history to be an attempt to write against this simplistic
Mm,
technology develops over time, states and coercion comes with that
mm.
technology.
I think you're probably right. And I think that I'd see actually all of Graeber's books as being more or less a challenge to this, what you often call evolutionary approach to macro history. I think this is not just true of debt, but I also think on Kings, for instance, he's trying to make a very similar claim as well,
Mm-hmm.
that we weren't always egalitarian. We, at the very least, had a hierarchy in our cosmology. We had notions of kings in the spirit realm. It was just a matter of eventually getting those kings from the spirit realm into the physical realm. That's what really changed. And of course, the dawn of everything is exactly the same. It's really trying to prioritize agency over material conditions being the driving force behind history. Now, I must note at the beginning here, I definitely disagree with Graeber. He's one of my biggest intellectual idols. He's definitely kind of been, I think, one of the biggest influences on me, particularly my turn towards more anarchist thinking. However, I'm definitely much more of a materialist here. But nonetheless, I'm happy to speak to debt. And I think he does have some good points in it nonetheless. So I think I'm similar insofar as I do see Graeber's attempts here with debt to be exactly that. He's trying to go against the materialist reading of history. And you also see this in the very way he conceptualizes debt, right? Where he sees debt as beginning not in terms of like a very basic exchange currency, but it really begins in notions of social obligation to one another. It's actually much more of a kind of values based system. Then what happens is that it's eventually kind of mathematically refined and then backed by coercion, the use of force. So once you start to combine violence and kind of quantification, that's where debt becomes dangerous. And Graeber, as we all know, has these kind of notions of these cycles. And the cycles are essentially between kind of credit money, which you can think of as virtual money, and bullion. So this is pretty much coinage. So in particular, having these big ingots of gold, silver, etc. Now, first of all, quickly pause here on credit. The key thing here is that credit money essentially is more or less individualistic. It's like you going to your bar and basically taking up a tab. And it relies heavily upon, at least in the Bronze Age in particular, notions of trust and social connection. You usually have things like promissory notes, where you can more or less say IOUs, for instance. That's what they are. In the case of coinage and bullion, it's quite different. These are essentially tokens of value, which you can exchange with more or less anyone. And Graeber's key contention here is that you have a switch from virtual currency towards bullion, or kind of hard coinage, when there's very large periods of violence. And that's essentially because a soldier is someone who needs to be able to go to different places and basically not have to rely upon credit or social connection, but rather actually just be able to basically take goods and services with some kind of flexible form of value. And additionally, a soldier is a really bad credit risk. So most creditors would not want to give them any kind of promissory note. But the state is obviously quite happy to develop something like coinage, which they can pay their soldiers in. The soldiers can then use in a local market, and that can be paid back by tax as well. And Graeber essentially sees these big cycles throughout history, which are in many ways both cycles of debt and these movement between virtual and hard currency, but they're also pretty much cycles of imperial superstructures. Because, of course, keep in mind that debt here and the use in particular of bullion and hard coinage is because of empire. It's because of a very large imperial superstructure, which is propping up this system of economic exploitation and this system of economic exchange. So the actual cycles that Graeber points to is basically one beginning with the Bronze Age. That's where he sees the kind of first uses of virtual currency, of credit in particular. That pretty much starts to end roughly in 600 CE. And this is where you start to see the real first forms of coinage in both Lydia and the Aegean, basically a Greek city-state, and additionally in China. There's some discussion as to whether northern India had its own version of kind of separate coinage, but there's people on both sides. I don't really have a dog in that game. I don't really mind. It may have been a pristine coin. It may not have been. It doesn't really matter too much to me. Either way, roughly this same period, which some people call the Axial Age, because you start to see this manifestation of very large monotheistic religions and a whole bunch of other sweeping cultural changes as well, Graeber points to as being the big shift from basically credit towards debt, from virtual money towards bullion and hard currency. And then he basically sees it happening again. So you have a reign of debt all the way during Roman times, basically until more or less the fall of Rome. And then you have the medieval period, which is marked more by, once again, credit-based localized systems. And then he sees the rise of colonial empires as being a re-establishment of debt. And that's pretty easy to see when you think about what Spain was digging up in places like Mesoamerica and South America, primarily silver and gold. So that's probably the most important cycles you need to think of. He then goes even further and talks about Nixon basically floating the US dollar away from the gold reserve. I don't think we need to go into that too much. So it might be worthwhile taking a step back here, if you're interested in Graham, and actually talking about, are cycles even a good thing to talk about when it comes to history? Are these just like quack science, these pseudo-science when it comes to history? Should we be taking this seriously at all?
So, yes, I agree. We should step back and talk about this question of whether cycles are even worth thinking about with history. I'll say a couple things, and I'll turn it over to the expert. First, it does seem like cycles make sense if the options are history is sort of marching in a teleological direction somewhere versus history is literally just a grab bag and is, nothing, and you can't make sense out of it. If you don't like those two options, I see you're going to grasp around for something else, and it seems like cycles make sense. The other thing, and this is just something I'm not qualified to judge at all, is when you start talking about all of these empires and you're suggesting that they are developing at around the same time, roughly 5,000 years ago, and doing kind of similar things, it seems like either evolutionary, like a straightforward evolution, or cycles seems to apply. Like that seems to cut against the just like history is a mismatch of things and no one knows what's happening. Like I'm really struck by this claim that all of these in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Egypt, and China at around the same time, we get similar imperial constructions. That at least seems like something is happening. So that's my first crack at it, and you can take it away.
Agreed. I think it's often astounding how much convergence you see, and it's not always a good thing. When you look across, say, for instance, the Aztec Empire, the Incan Empire, and most of the empires in antiquity. So these are separated by oceans and never had any contact, totally different geographies, and yet they all develop societies which are based upon force. They have kings, and all of them, barring the Inca, have slavery. And the Inca instead have what's called the metu, which is basically more or less conscription-based labor, which is pretty close to slavery, but not quite the same thing. But nonetheless, they converge in these really radical ways despite vast differences in geography, in environment, and even time as well. So I think that's something that strikes me, which gives me much more credence in the idea that either we could potentially be dealing with cycles or potentially be dealing with some kind of evolutionary trajectory. Like you, I was never much for what the idea of history is just one damn thing after another. Of course, things are contingent. Of course, individual events and people can have some kind of ripple effect. Nonetheless, I think it's foolish to kind of ignore the big patterns we see, and there's definitely patterns all across history.
I mean, I would even go so far as to say, while it's obviously true that in some sense history is just one damn thing after another, that ends up synonymous with nihilism. I mean, if it is simply one damn thing after another, then none of it really matters. And if none of it matters, then congratulations, we're done. Just go out and do whatever you want, and nothing matters. And that's not appealing to me.
Yeah, I've never been a fan of either moral or epistemological nihilism, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of cycles is one which surprisingly quite a few, at least macro historians, do take seriously. So there's a whole bunch of different ones. If we go all the way back, Polybius was actually something of a macro historian. So it's a Greek philosopher. And essentially, he had the idea that polities age and decline and grow just like organisms do. And he actually kind of forecast the decline and fall of Rome based upon exactly that. That he thought it was eventually going to go through some kind of process of aging. So that's like a really basic idea of cycles. I mean, Polybius, the key thing is he didn't really have a good reason as to why he thought the cycle was occurring. You lacked a causal mechanism. There's others, like archaeologists, for instance, Joyce Marcus, who was a Mesoamerican archaeologist, and she noticed amongst the Mayan polities, you saw this kind of process of capture and fracture. So it'd be like 200 years where kind of empire would take over a larger region, and then eventually would fracture apart. And a different city-state would do the same thing. And people have seen very similar phenomena for Mesopotamia as well. So Mesopotamia, you often remember the kind of big overarching empires like the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians. However, much of Mesopotamia's history was actually more broken up into these autonomous city-states or warring amongst each other. So there's definitely people who take these cycles seriously. But once again, the problem is they often don't have a good reason as to why the cycle is occurring and why it's lasting for a particular set period of time. Probably the best version of kind of cyclical theory I've seen is Peter Turchin, the idea of structural demographic theory you may have come across. So Turchin is, interesting enough, originally a biologist. He studied lemmings initially, and he dealt with these models called predator-prey models. And pretty self-explanatory. It's a pretty simple model dealing with how predators often overkill their prey, and it kind of creates a boom-bust cycle in the population. And he thought, I'm bored of biology. Why don't I go into history and apply this to societies and look at this in relationship between predator-prey, the masses, commoners, and elites. And after many, many years and a lot of data gathering, he started to see certain kinds of trends. And he puts it all down to this idea of structural demographic theory, which is basically that as you have a growing population, what tends to happen is you get more and more elites over time because they're passing on their wealth. And it's kind of, there's also the phenomenon of elites getting better and better at basically taking more and more of the surplus. And secondly, that as you get more people, their labor becomes less scarce. And that means they tend to get paid less. And so you have these two different factors coming together, which means usually people start to get less and less real income. You get what's called popular immiseration. So most people end up being better, worse off. And you start to get lots of elites competing for a very small number of powerful positions in an empire or a social hierarchy. And those two big factors, elite competition and popular immiseration, eventually cause a crisis, and in some cases, even a collapse. And he basically puts these down to a number of different cycles, usually ranging between 200 to 500 years, and puts them across a whole bunch of different historical cases, including, of course, Rome and a bunch of European dynasties, and even the current day US. So there's people who take cycles very seriously, and I personally have no de facto reason as to why we shouldn't expect a cycle. For me, the much more important thing is, does it have empirical evidence? And does it actually have a good causal explanation? So let's look at Graeber's idea of cycles in regards to those two. So Graeber, of course, as mentioned, does have this idea of cycles, starting with the Bronze Age, essentially, ending with the Iron Age, then the Iron Age more or less through to the modern period. Also, to the medieval, I should say, and then to the modern period. I think he's certainly onto something. I don't think it's kind of strange, right, that both empires start cropping up in different areas of the world roughly at the same time. And additionally, that they all start to develop, or at least a couple of them start to develop things like coinage at roughly the same time. I think what's lacking here is Graeber never really develops or articulates a clear theory as to why these cycles would be occurring. And to me, that's a pretty big missing hole in the heart of the theory. Is if you can't articulate why is this happening, it makes it far less believable. Empirically, I think there's also some problems. And the two big problems I have here are, one, empirically, he's right that you do see these kind of cycles. The problem is they're more or less constrained primarily to Europe and a little bit to Eurasia, so across Europe and Asia. We don't necessarily see them elsewhere in the world. And secondly, is that, and I think this is actually a bigger one, why don't we see a rise in coinage with the Bronze Age? So if David's right, this is mainly about violence, then the creation of the Bronze Age empires, these initial empires about Mesopotamia, China, Egypt, they involved massive amounts of violence and organized warfare. These were very similar in terms of their violence rates to the formation of Iron Age empires. Why is it that you get coinage and you get this slip towards bullion-based systems, while the Bronze Age, you get a lot of violence, but you have the exact opposite. You get the creation of credit systems. Just doesn't make a lot of sense in my eyes. I think there is an explanation here, and I think it's quite simple, is that in the Iron Age, you had empires that were trying to take over both much larger populations and much larger territories. And because of that, they had to rely upon different, more abstract, flexible forms of currency. In this case, things like coinage and bullion. While in the case of the creation of Bronze Age empires, it tended to be pretty small city-states, and so they could rely much more upon localized systems of exchange, like credit and promissory notes. So I do think there's a way to tweak his theory to actually make it a bit more applicable. Later on, again, I think this is something that's primarily European, and it's actually much more about empires than it is about kind of debt-based systems. Just empires do like using debt, and they like using coinage because it's easier to do that over a very large period and a very large population. So I personally see there's some legs in Graeber's theory. I think he didn't quite go all the way there, and I think there's a whole bunch of caveats, but I think there's something to it.
Okay, a few things here. First, that all makes sense to me. And in the book Debt, he provides lots of examples, especially early in the book, from Mesopotamia, but he actually does not do a historical chapter on this first couple of thousand years of these agrarian empires. When the actual chapter by chapter histories start, he doesn't ever cover those empires. Perhaps again because it doesn't make sense. I'm also very, very sympathetic to this idea that these things that we think of as empires are in some ways city-states or expanded city-states. To speak briefly from my own experience, and I think this will work, as I was trying to figure out where, when we started having U.S. dollars, because in the 19th century literature that I read, no one has greenbacks. There's no dollars. And I would try and look into it, and it was like, oh yeah, we've always had these U.S. dollars. And I was trying to figure out what was happening. Well, I guess the government was always printing money, but people weren't using it. They were mostly using what was called banknotes, which is just a banker would, write, stamp, sign, and say, this is $100. But of course, it wasn't ever $100 unless you personally knew the banker. And the further you got from the bank, the less money it would be worth. And it's a real bold claim a banker can make to say, like, my notes are honored at face value from San Francisco to New York. That would just be unheard of. So you can have paper money, debt money, credit money, but the further you go from this financial center, the less valuable it is. So if you've got empires that are a lot smaller than the United States, you can have this kind of paper money. There can be some sort of centralized state that is in some ways, backing the financial system itself, but they don't have to make the currency. You can let the merchants or whoever make the currency, but then that currency is going to flow very well where you've got face-to-face relationships, or if not face-to-face relationships, generalized social trust. And if it has to go across a continent, as Chinese money has to do, but Babylonian money does not have to do, it makes sense that you would get something different. I mean, that's where this makes sense to me, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I'm alluding to as well, is that it really comes down not just simply violence. I think, Graeber really tries to pivot most of this upon when you get lots of violence, you get lots of soldiers, and soldiers prefer bullion and coinage over things like credit-based systems. And as mentioned, that doesn't really check out insofar as we should have seen exactly the same thing happen in the Bronze Age empires. I think it really does come back down to imperial control. That if you're trying to control a very large populace and a very large economy, it makes sense to have these kind of abstractions that work, as you mentioned, across different groups, ethnicities, and people who don't have any kind of sense of localized trust or anything like that, which is kind of what empires are always doing, right? That's always the challenge they faced. A good kind of comparison here would actually be looking somewhere Graeber doesn't look. So Mesoamerica. it's primarily focused on Eurasia, but shouldn't we see the same cycles in South America and Mesoamerica? So amongst the Inca, the Wari, the Tiwanaku, for instance, and amongst the Aztecs and Teotihuacan, we don't really, and we don't ever see, interestingly enough, the development of coinage in those places. And the best explanation I've seen for that is that those places basically just don't have, well, a couple of things. A, usually is concentrated populations. So by far the biggest city you had at any stage was pretty much Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire. That was roughly probably 200,000, maybe 400,000 people. Rome, by comparisons, over a million. And additionally, they never actually develop wheel technology. They don't develop wheels because they don't really have any large domesticated animals. So, in short, there's basically less capital. And less capital means there's less goods flowing around, which also means usually the empires had kind of less material to try and control. Less people and less material to control pretty much means you don't necessarily need to have things like coinage, for instance. And I think that goes partly to explain why you don't see the same kind of cycles or the same invention of coinage in Mesoamerica and South America that you see in Eurasia. I think what Graeber is looking at here is just one manifestation of a much larger complex of social control. At the same time you get things like coinage developing, it's the Axial Age, right? It's also development of things like monotheistic religions. So I see this as actually part of a broader package that empires were developing to better control much larger, more diverse, and bigger populations across large territories. So again, I think he's onto something. I think that it needs a fair bit of adjustments and it needs to be more or less like centered upon Eurasia. It doesn't necessarily apply outside of that, but there's something there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And unfortunately, I already recorded. I recorded my episode on the Middle Ages with the historian Eleanor Yaniga pretty early in the process, and now I just want to go back. We discussed this briefly and ask her, like, does this concept of the Middle Ages? I mean, I did ask her, but we didn't speak at length. Does this concept of the Middle Ages make sense in terms of Afro-Eurasia? Because I was teaching my students Echo's Dreaming of the Middle Ages
Yeah.
and the concept of the Middle Ages recently, and my claim to my students is the concept of the Middle Ages is essentially to say there was this thing that was really great called antiquity, and it had all this awesome stuff like Athens and Rome, and then things just kind of sucked for 1,000 years, and then people in the same place, Italy, started making awesome stuff again, and we get Venice and Florence and eventually London and Paris, and in between things were just kind of crappy. That story doesn't make sense in China, it
Yeah.
seems to me. First there used to be this great thing called China, and then it went away around 500, and now in 1500 we have China back. That story doesn't make sense. I see this as almost like a Mediterranean story. So the concept of the Middle Ages, I'm pretty skeptical of. And how do you have these cycles if the Middle Ages don't even happen in the other parts of the places that are supposedly experiencing these cycles?
Yeah, I think the Middle Ages or the medieval period is essentially more or less a kind of European construct. And even then, it doesn't make that much sense necessarily. I think you're right. I mean, basically, the story you gave me there is pretty much what Petrarch, who's the original Renaissance man who coined the term Dark Age, was referring to. He saw the light of Roman antiquity and compared that to the Dark Ages he was experiencing, and hence light versus dark age. But that doesn't really hold up either. Like, even if you actually look within Europe, these weren't particularly bad periods. Like, you had actually pretty good improvements in agricultural productivity. I forget the exact figures, but something like it was like a 15 to 20% increase in agricultural output per person. You actually have a whole bunch of different technologies come online as well. The iron plow, for instance, which is really useful, particularly on clay soils. Improved mirrors, windmills, a whole bunch of other things. So it wasn't dark by any means, just didn't have a big overarching empire. And you're right as well that this varies quite a lot. So it is true that the Han Dynasty falls apart roughly the same time as Western Empire. The big difference is Europe never gets a unified empire at the top of it again. China does repeatedly. You have the Song, you have the Qing, you have many others thereafter. So it's quite different. And also, if you look just a little bit further south towards the Near East, you have a whole bunch of empires, including the Caliphate, which actually is so successful, expands out into Europe at stages.
Yeah, I mean, what I told my students is the Caliphate is essentially the big empire
Yeah.
in this part of the world. So if you're really, if you're Petrarch and what you're thinking of is Italy, then yeah, there isn't a big unifying empire between 500 and 1500, but there's actually a big unifying empire that covers a lot of the same lands that
Yep.
were part of the Roman Empire. So you just have to, I mean, literally, they create this concept of Europe, although they call it Christendom before they end up calling it Europe, really
Yep.
to make sense of this problem, which is there is a big empire, but they are not a part of it. And I take the
Yep.
Middle Ages as a concept to be a sort of Western mistake, and I take that as a blow, at least to this version of the cycles of history, even though, as you say, there's lots of really interesting and productive stuff in here.
Yeah. And again, I think for me, that's mainly just a refinement of the theory insofar as, again, this is less about like debt over the grand history and arc of our history. Sorry, the grand arc of history. It's much more, this is how debt as one instrument of imperial control has happened primarily in the context of Europe. And yeah, we see it a little bit in China as well, but it's primarily a European phenomenon he's looking at. That's the cycle he's talking about is really concentrated within Western Europe. And once again, it's really much more about imperial control than it is about debt and the movement between bullion versus credit-based systems per se. And even if you are going to talk about that, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that even at times when we had more credit-based systems, there was still the use of debt, and vice versa as well. Even when you still have a kind of primarily debt-based systems, there's still the use of localized credit systems as well. It's kind of more the kind of dominant mode of exchange, if you will.
Well, one more thing, and this is taking us a long way from the Bronze Age before we move on from this, is I've become increasingly convinced, rereading this book carefully, that debt is only half of the story. The other half is slavery. And the
Yeah,
reason why he thinks there is a Middle Ages is because he claims that slavery, um,
gets
in
abolished,
whatever,
which it doesn't.
yeah. Anyways, you can take it away here.
Yeah, I mean, David, R.I.P., rest in power, love him. He is always provocative and interesting. He isn't always right. And there's definitely some claims in the book where it's off the mark. And so the idea, for instance, that slavery just disappears during the medieval ages or is abolished in some way just simply isn't true. You still have a whole bunch of different versions of slavery active. It's true that there's less direct slavery of European laborers vis-a-vis antiquity, but it's not disappearing by any means. It's definitely reduced in some way. And so, and again, this is just something which there had to be a bit more clarification, like clear theoretical argumentation. I make it more believable, basically. And I think you're right that there is a really close concentration here between debt and slavery. And of course, it's kind of one of the key ideas of the book, right? Is that debt creates things like debt peonage, debt slavery. It ends up creating whole sorts of different forms of human bondage, basically. And again, that just becomes another version of imperial control.
Okay, now now we've pretty much done what we needed to do, and I want to head into some uncharted waters, which is I want to take this back to the question of quackery. And before I
Mm-hmm.
do, I want to say I'm very very impressed and intrigued by your work. And I also, I was speaking to the economist James K. Galbraith, and he was talking about importing biological concepts into economics. And we've got Diamond lurking here as a person who is, it just seems to me. So how I'm going to try and put this in a way. I am both. I mean, suspicious is far too weak a word. I am utterly opposed to the professionalization of knowledge as it exists and how it tends to make us throw lots of interesting ideas away and frankly write fucking terrible books all the time. All academic books are fucking terrible because of this problem. And then perhaps, Luke, perhaps this is just my training within that professionalization system. I have a PhD. I can't throw it away. When people start saying like, oh, I was looking at this and I discovered that evolution is the secret to something, or actually, if you apply the second law of thermodynamics, I can explain to you what happened to the Aztecs, and then I get suspicious of that as well. So
Yeah.
can you steer me between this, like the thing I don't want to be, which is a pedantic, rigid respecter of academic epistemology, because I'm on record as being as about against that as I can be, without letting me fall for just cranks and quacks, which again is why I'm talking to you, because I don't consider you a crank or a quack. I'm sure that's obvious, but yeah,
Great.
I know
I
that
am
warms your
genuinely
heart.
flattered.
But
This is one of the greatest compliments I've ever heard.
no, but seriously, look, someone who works for something called the Society for Existential Risk, like you would, I'm sure there's people out there who have similar named organizations that they've incorporated as a nonprofit, and everything they say is bullshit, right? Like these people
Yeah,
are out there, and obviously, plenty of people put Graeber in that category as well.
and to be frank, like even with my own field, I consider a lot of the stuff that's produced to be really poor quality and frankly sometimes bullshit as well. So I share your skepticism. I think I share your skepticism both in terms of the work you read sometimes and get peer reviewed and published can just be of
Jesus.
incredibly bad caliber. But on top of that, there's just certain conventions as well, which I think really strangle the democratization of knowledge. And the big one here is just academia encourages people to write poorly. And this is
Yeah.
one of the things I love about Graeber is, he just took the idea of being kind to your reader and just put it in exactly his prose. He just made things clear. He's having a conversation with you through the written word. And that's, I think, what made him so popular as well. That being said, I mean, one of the problems here is that science, when it comes down to it, I like to follow Naomi Oreskes' idea here that it's really just an epistemological community. At the end of the day, we have to rely upon and trust in institutions that are there basically verify and adopt some kind of consensus position around knowledge. And they'll get it wrong, but in general, we kind of have to trust they'll find better and worse ways. They'll kind of find better ways of doing it over time. I mean, the problem here is that there's some fields where there's just no easy way to necessarily verify or to basically improve and like have a feedback loop when it comes to are you actually right about these things. And I think it gets even trickier once you start doing interdisciplinary work like I do. I'm trying to do both kind of macro history, but I also try to bring in ideas from a whole bunch of different areas I know, things like economics, for instance, anthropology. And that gets even trickier because you have to rely increasingly upon kind of deferring to other people who you more or less trust. And honestly, there's no easy way around it. The closest I come to it is basically thinking, if I read something and I'm suspicious, I try to at the very least look at what's the alternatives, but also is it kind of multiple lines of evidence supporting this? And if there's multiple lines of evidence, I'm going to have a much higher credence in that argument, basically. The other thing is I tend to, where possible, stick to reading books, and in particular, books either from people I know do good work or a reference from people I know who good work. So kind of a snowballing approach. Books, I mean, it's just basically people are going to put more time and effort into it, and there's a kind of high gatekeeping function there than a blog. And snowballing through trust, I mean, it's just pretty basic. If you know someone's work is good and they're meticulous, they're more likely to also be referencing and using other sources meticulous too. Nonetheless, I think it's a problem, and it's not one I've never had a full, easy answer to. I think we kind of have to rely upon a certain level of trust in scientific institutions, even though they do at times suck.
Yeah. Yeah, but I as the counterbalance, so someone like Graeber
Yeah.
and Mumford, for example, did this incredibly interesting and productive work without ever being fully in the. I mean, Graeber's anthropological work, my understanding is, was fully within the tradition of anthropology, but something like Debt or The Dawn of Everything was not. I mean, that was not books that the anthropology community would recognize as anthropology, but we don't want him not to have written those books, and
Absolutely.
then we're just back into a muddle again.
Yeah, for me, I have zero respect for disciplinary boundaries. I think I just take a problem, and I think what are the most appropriate tools for understanding that problem. And I think David took a pretty similar approach in some regards. I think he always still had a very firm grounding in anthropology, and you even see that in Debt, right? Like Debt,
Mhm.
it doesn't start with this kind of idea of debt as a problem in economics. It starts as a problem in anthropology of how do we actually repay social obligations to each other, and how is this done throughout history, and then kind of have this eventually become monetized and mathematized. So even there, we're still, of course, impacted by our disciplinary grounding to a certain extent. But I think, yeah, the value in what Graeber did is he didn't mind too much branching into other fields. And of course, once again, that requires a certain level of trust because you won't be able to read every article meticulously. You'll have to a certain degree, trust the institutions you're dealing with. And I have this, for instance, when I'm doing anything to do with like work on the human brain or psychology.
Mm.
I don't have the ability to go and look at whether that machine learning algorithm actually had the right code. I can check with a friend of mine who does some of that work, but ultimately I'm going to rely upon, to a certain extent, that if it got published in Nature a few years ago and no one's published a retraction since, it's probably a good sign. But yeah, I think there's a lot of room and scope for doing this much more grand interdisciplinary work. And I think the fact that Debt and The Dawn of Everything were such hits show exactly that. People want to have solutions to problems. They want to understand the way phenomena in the world work. They don't necessarily want a disciplinary thesis.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for going down that epistemological road with me. Anything else you would like to say before we wrap up?
I mean, I feel like one day we should do a separate podcast on The Dawn of Everything so I can voice some of my vociferous criticisms. But
Sure. I mean, I was going to say, I guess I'll just break in and take your last word away, and you can still have a last word. Is tell us about the book when it comes out, and we'll definitely do an episode on that.
Sounds good. So the book is currently titled Goliath's Curse, A Deep History of Societal Collapse and What It Means for Our Future. It is due to be out with Penguin, I think, in March of 2025. To be confirmed, and it'll be slightly different for different countries. It has some similarities to Debt. I'm essentially trying to take a slightly different problem, this idea of societal collapse, and do a very similar thing of trying to trace it back to its very earliest origins and understand both why it occurs, what it means, and can we predict it or kind of forecast it into the future in any kind of general sense? And it's worth putting a quick little flag up here and saying, I use the term collapse with, a bit of tongue in cheek. I think most of the time, this is one of the key ideas in the book. Collapse historically hasn't been a bad thing for your average citizen. It often meant a whole bunch of good things. But if you look at, say, for instance, Somalia, which is one of the most recent cases of state failure, people often think of Somalia as being essentially a hellhole. Yet, weirdly enough, Somalia, after the Bahrain regime falls away, it improves in every single quality of life indicator, except for education, and that's purely because the West withdraws its funding.
Right.
So collapse doesn't need to be a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, Chomsky makes this joke decades ago. We've got this term failed state, which is supposed to be the worst possible thing that can happen, but an actual failed state may not be that bad. And also his parallel joke is in addition to something like Iraq or Somalia being a failed state that we have to intervene in, the United States of America, it seems like a pretty failed state in terms of its stated democratic ideals. And so yeah, from an anarchist point of view, you're going to have a hard time convincing someone that a failed state is the worst possible thing that can ever happen.
Yeah. In these cases, it's just kind of silly insofar as places like Somalia, they were basically colonial constructs. They were never like full states to begin with. It's really more dealing with a failed order than a failed state. And on top of that, if you're going to talk about failed states as being those who don't provide public goods or welfare for their citizens, then most states throughout history have been failed.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Jesus. Now there's a line to end on. But I am going to ask Ian if there's anything else you want to say before I let you go.
I don't think so. I think I'm good. I think we've been very meticulous.
Look, I think this was fantastic. Thank you so much, Luke. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Graham. It was my pleasure.